Well, it's great to be with you again for another leadership lockdown conversation. And I have a great privilege today of being joined by Carey Nieuwhof. Carey, thank you so much for being with us. How are you?
Hey, Rob, I love the title Leadership Lockdown. That's exactly what it is. I've spent more time in my basement here in the last 40 days than I think in the previous 4 years. So yeah, we're being very, very familiar with lockdown.
Yeah, well, your setup's looking great. And the first question I'd love to ask you in the midst of lockdown, obviously we're in this global pandemic. It's no respecter of persons. And in the midst of it, people are going to be trying to lead themselves, trying to forget about the fear, the anxiety, maybe an element of intimidation by the uncertainty of the future, whilst trying to lead other people in the midst of trying to lead themselves. So how do we lead ourselves, self-leadership, whilst leading others in the midst of this pandemic?
That's a great question, and something I think we're all struggling with, and we're all struggling in different ways. One of the ways I'm struggling with it is just like the whole rhythm of life has been disrupted.
Yeah.
So if you look at what's happening, like for me, I'm used to a travel rhythm. So travel's been part of my life for over a decade or more. And, right now I've been basically in my house for 40 days with the exception of going to get groceries. And I think boundaries get really confused that way. If I have an addiction, it's to work. So what I will do is I won't drink too much. I won't, do drugs or anything like that. But it's like, okay, well, I'll just keep my laptop open. And so I think boundaries can be really difficult. And as a lot of leaders have probably discovered, we're recording this 40 days into it. The first week felt like a lot of dislocation, and I had all this open time that was like just wide open because I had all these speaking engagements canceled. I was supposed to be in Australia. I was supposed to be in, the Midwest. I was supposed to be in California. And then that's all canceled. And you're like, wow, I have all this time. And what's happened in the last well, first of all, you jump into the chasm and it's like, how can we serve leaders? So I produced a free course that we've been able to enroll almost 8,000 leaders in the last 2 weeks. And, went from idea to execution in about 10 days. Then we pivoted, did another podcast. I partnered up with the Barna Group and with Glue, a company in Colorado. So we launched this thing called Church Pulse Weekly, brand new podcast, got that off the ground. And then what's happened recently is the deluge is just poured in with webinar requests, interview requests.
Yes.
And I was telling you just before we started recording, my team and I just called a hard stop to that this week. It's like, we just can't do this all. There's so many opportunities. So it's really bizarre to me that as much as what felt like a horrible vacation, horrible because people are dying and you're in lockdown, but like, wow, my calendar is more open than it's been in the last 5 years, is suddenly just as confusing and busy and in crisis mode as everything else. And I've got to now redraw all new boundaries. And I mean, I did the course on this, the high impact leader. So, I mean, I should know, but like it's changing so fast. And that's been really confusing, I think, for everybody. So for me, yeah, like this has been really a challenging season. And it seems like the issues pivot every month, every week, I would say. Every week seems like there's a new dragon to slay.
Wow. How do we as leaders get the balance between production, which you're clearly invested in, the courses you're putting out, the speaking engagements? How do we balance production with the inundation, the saturation of consumption? So it's like production or consumption. Do we take in all this negativity, all this worry, all the forecasting about the future? Or like, do we get our head down and we're kind of aware of what's going on, but we're just going to focus on what we've got in front of us today, even though we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, Rob, one of the things you have to do is you have to create a filter because I don't know about you. I usually have, our joke is we try to create a space for the good people on the internet. But I've noticed an uptick, particularly in the last 2 weeks, of just really negative comments of people just taking shots. I had a guest on my podcast today and, really super guy who's made a huge difference in the world. And like the first comment was just a guy saying, oh, this company that he led went bankrupt in 1998. Ha ha. And I'm like, that's what you're going to, this is your contribution to humanity right now. Like, really, this is what you're doing?
Yeah.
And so we're going to take that comment down, but there's a lot of garbage out there, a lot of misinformation. And so part of my job, if I'm going to lead myself through this crisis, my team through the crisis, and leaders through this crisis, is I've got to get really reliable sources. So who are you going to trust to give you information? And then there's a certain sense in which I need to be consuming accurate, reliable information that even tells me what's happening in the world, what's happening with the coronavirus, what's happening in the markets, what's happening in the economy, what's happening. I was researching lockdown orders as we're recording this. America in some states is scheduled to open again in a couple of days. And I'm like, okay, that seems early to me, just candidly speaking, but I'm texting with friends trying to figure out, what does that feel like in Georgia? What does that feel like? Is California going to do the same thing? So I'm trying to go to reliable sources to figure that out so that my next post isn't like something that was stuck in 3 weeks ago. So I need to be consuming, but I also have to make sure that those negative voices, like you can get into an internet fight really fast today, and I'm scrappier than I normally am. Like I usually can just let it go, but like I'll be really scrappy right now. You want to go? Come on, I'll take you on. It's like being pent up for 40 days, right? So I have to limit that in myself. On the other hand, so I've got to have content consumption so that I can produce helpful material, but there also has to be a limit. And so what I've done, I'm on Strava, which is like a fitness app. I've cycled more kilometers this year than I had at this point last year or any other year up until mid-April. And I also took up running. So I'm going to go for a run today. I've got interviews all day, and then I'm going to go for a run before dinner. So I think you have to, because now you're home all the time. You could work all the time or you could consume all the time. And I think both have shadow sides. And if you overconsume, there's only so much news you can take once you know what's going on. Shut it down. I have not watched TV news this entire time. I get it all off my phone. But my wife and I will try to close the laptops, have a meaningful dinner together, hang out, play a game, go for a run, go for a bike ride. We're allowed to do that where I am. Lockdown isn't total. And then, these days we're gravitating. We tried Tiger King, and that was too depressing. So we're watching The Office, an episode or two before you go to bed at night, just to do something fun, and then playing virtual games with friends. And so, because the problem right now is all those other constraints and limits and systems I had in my life are gone. And now you've got to create a new constraint in a very confusing time. So I don't get it right every day. That first week of the lockdown, I'm working with a lot of West Coast people right now. So I'm New York time zone in Toronto, and I was dealing with a lot of California people. And so they want to be on phone calls at 10 o'clock at night. And I just said to my time, and I just said to my wife, Tony, I'm like, yeah, this does not scale. This doesn't scale. And so we put that in a box. We got our time zones worked out. But yeah, it's just crazy. People don't know what day it is. People don't know what month it is. People, and so I think all that impacts your leadership.
You've obviously, in the last few years, the podcast, I'd love you to talk about the genesis of your podcast. It reaches, over I'm going to get the statistic wrong, but it's definitely over 1 million people have either subscribed or tuned in. Is that right?
Yeah, we're at 11 million downloads, and it's about 300,000 a month will listen to the podcast, which is just insane to me right now.
Yeah. So on that, I'd love to hear the genesis of your heart behind starting that and your vision for it going forward. But before that, with the influence you have, there must come a degree and dimension of responsibility. And obviously you've talked about a few things that help you to relax when you turn off the laptop, but how have you personally built an infrastructure and a foundation to carry the weight of that many people? If you multiplied all the hours of time that's going into listening to you, that's phenomenal, really.
No, well, thank you, Rob. And, I think one of the things that really has helped me is I'm 55. So really, if you look at, I've been doing this for 25, 30 years. And for the most part, I've been saying a lot of the same things, but just nobody showed up for the first decade or two. Wow. So that's really helpful. I was sharing stuff on church growth when it meant me getting into my car after dinner, driving 45 minutes into a church basement, sharing it with an elder board, all of them kind of looking at me going, that doesn't make any sense. And then they give me a gas card for showing up, to fill up my car with petrol.
Oh.
And I drive home at night going, well, I think I just wasted an evening. And now what's happened in the last decade is a lot of people showed up. So I think having spent most of my life without an audience really prepares you to have one. I don't know what, I think sometimes about 12-year-old YouTubers. It's like, and they got a million followers. It's like, I don't know that I'm handling it particularly well right now, but like, I can't imagine handling that at 22 or 25. I had an interesting podcast conversation with Jeff Bethke, him in Hawaii. And Jeff and I were talking about that. And like, he's only really been himself. And he's, I think, around 30 now. He's the first generation of people. Like, he didn't have to have a day job to do what he's doing as an influencer. He was just kind of always an influencer, because Jefferson Bethke dropped that, that YouTube video about Jesus that went viral in 2012 when he was, 19, 20, 21, 22. And then he's just spent the last decade being himself. And that's like really weird. So I think having decades ahead of time when nobody was paying attention really helped. And then really good people. Like, I live in the same house I've lived in for 25 years. Nobody here knows what I do. And frankly, nobody really cares. And that's wonderful. So it's great to be able to just go to local grocery store and not get bothered. It's harder in the US because I will get recognized and so on, particularly at conferences and leadership circles. But here, it's just the same old. I'm just the guy who pastored that church and, obsessively cleans his cars. So it's very grounding. And then having a lot of the same people in your life. But so, and just don't take yourself too seriously. Like, I tell my team all the time, one day nobody's going to read, no one's going to listen, and no one's going to care. But right now we have the season of influence. It's our job to steward it. And to also realize that what took years to build can take seconds to lose, and to really see that as a trust from God, that I can say the wrong thing, particularly when I'm punchy, or I can do the wrong thing, or I can make a really bad decision morally that would just, crush the faith and trust that's taken years to build up. And, I ask, when people ask, how can you pray for me? It's just like wisdom, discernment, protection. And that's really a good thing. And married to the same woman for 30 years, that helps. She keeps me really grounded.
Congratulations. I love that. And you model it because, in your book, there's a whole chapter on character. And I think that's a facet of leadership we don't often spend too much time writing about or acknowledging. But do you think that grounds you when criticism comes? Because you must, with that many people listening to your podcast, you must get one or two people with the odd comment or the odd whatever slander. How do you deal with criticism?
Yeah, it's hard. I would say we don't get hit as much as many people do online, partly because I'm not out seeking controversy. So we try to be positive on the internet. We try to find the good news stories. We're not out like, here's what's wrong with so-and-so mega church pastor. That's not our style. So, I think if you're going to play in that swamp, you're going to get dirty. But we get trolls. And so what I try to imagine is, I'm not right on everything. I try to write with a certain posture of humility, a certain posture of experimentation. So, I've got, 5 ways to count online church attendance, but I'm not pontificating here. I don't pretend that I've got this all figured out. I would love to hear from you in the comments. And, you get some real practitioners who bring you some great insights that you hadn't thought of. So always trying to defer to your audience and realize there's a lot of collective wisdom there, but then you do get the trolls. And so sometimes what I'll do, I imagine a dinner time conversation. So you and I don't have to have to agree, but we can disagree without being disagreeable. Right. And I imagine the moment where if you were at dinner, if you start throwing expletives around or start insulting my wife, or you just become this, acerbic, toxic person, there's a moment at which I say, you know what, as much as it's been good to be here, I think you need to leave now. And so that's when we start deleting comments, is because it degrades the quality of the conversation. And then there was someone on Instagram, to give you a really current example, that has been leaving some comments for a while. And listen, I'm getting 99% positive encouragement, thoughtful, reflective, helpful stuff. But there was this one guy, and you get to know the frequent flyers. He's just like super negative, and he was taking on some other people in the comments and being insulting and rude. And I'm like, okay, this is like your fifth offense, blocked.
Yeah.
And we just block him. I don't know what happens with that. Maybe he's going to start a blog against me. I don't know. And then there are other times I've had another major blogger take me on a couple of times, and people are like, are you going to respond? And I'm like, there's no point. I mean, he just made me the butt of his joke, or he made me a bad example. And, you know, one of the things I've learned, and I'm not saying he's a pig, but, you know, never wrestle with a pig. You both get dirty, and the pig liked it. You can't win. You just can't win. And there have been so many times where I've tried to like, okay, well, maybe I'll just give this person the benefit of the doubt. And then they just come back at you and, you know, drop kick you. And it's like, you're not interested in learning. You're not interested in growing. And therefore I can't have a conversation with you. And so, yeah, we do block, we do delete, but it's like 0.5% of the time, 1% of the time. And I find if you try to be that reasonable voice, if you try to treat people the way that you want to be treated, most people are good people. And, you know, our unofficial mantra is a place for the good people on the internet to gather. And there are some good people on the internet. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes I'll make a mistake. You know, we post content, and there was a quote that I made on a blog that was just kind of pushed onto Twitter. And it doesn't matter what it was, but like it ignited this Twitter debate, which people were like, well, what did he mean? Is he encouraging us to disobey the stay-at-home order? Is that what he means? And then people are like, I'm sure that's not what he means. And then, you know, I could have let it go, but I'm like, you know what? They're right. That quote was out of context. It doesn't make sense as a standalone. I really appreciate the audience that kind of defended me, but I took it down, and then I said, guys, we posted something earlier. I take full responsibility. It didn't make sense out of context. I apologize. I'm sorry. And sometimes you just have to do that as a communicator, because what you meant wasn't what was heard. And so, yeah, I think, you know, as a leader, you should be the first to apologize. So sometimes I have to just say, I'm sorry. And then other times you think, wow, this guy's just gunning for a fight, and I'm not going to be his next victim.
That's really humble, a really humble response. And obviously there are moments of that, but the majority of the time it's absolutely amazing. The guests you have on and have had on fantastic. The next question is, if you had one guest on your podcast that really stands out, I'm sure they all do in their own way, but if there's one that really sticks in your memory, who was that person and why? And then as a follow-on from that question, who would you, if you could only have one more guest on your podcast, who would it be?
Oh gosh, I feel like I've had so many bucket list moments. So yeah, because I would say probably of the episodes that have aired, Gordon MacDonald was an impossible question to answer until I interviewed Gordon MacDonald last year. And he's 80 years old, and we have an email friendship now, which is great. Awesome. And he does those, right? If all the lockdowns get lifted this summer, my wife and I are going to go visit him and his wife in New England and just hang out with him. Yeah. But he distilled 80 years of wisdom into about a 90-minute conversation. And it was just so rich and so good and so fresh. So that was awesome. Also, it's not aired yet when we're recording this, but it will be in May. I got to spend a couple hours with Tim Keller in New York City.
Wow.
And that would have been like, yep, Tim Keller. I thought it might have taken 5 years to get the interview, but we managed to get that back in February. It'll air this spring on my podcast. And that was amazing. And one of those things where, honestly, I could have just gone back the next day, had the mic rolling for the entire day, and all of that would have been gold. So yeah. That was great. A couple of other guests. Mark Sayers is somebody I'm really getting to know. I'd love to have him back on. We just released an episode with him, my first one with him recently, and it was like the second biggest day in podcast history in a season when no one's listening to podcasts, which is great. And another leader I'm getting to know and will spend more time with is Mike Todd from Transformation Church.
Yeah.
Young 33-year-old leader who's just crushing it online, and I think is 5 to 10 years ahead of the rest of the church right now.
Wow.
Doing a great job of figuring out digital ministry. So I want to spend some time with him.
Amazing. And there are probably many things, but what's one thing that you know that the majority of us don't know that you think we need to know based on all your wisdom, every guest you've had? If you could condense it, consolidate it into one thought, what would it be?
The best ones are incredibly grounded. They remember your name. They're remarkably humble. The backstage is better than the onstage. And
That's beautiful.
In this age where everybody wants to be a celebrity, most 12-year-olds want to be YouTubers. We're all dreaming of fame, and we're all after vanity. And when you really look at what makes for success, it's remarkably grounded. Probably the other thing I would say is they've all been through crises. So we see, as Stephen Furtick said years ago, we see the highlight reel, but we don't see the B-roll. And there's a lot of B-roll in all of those lives. Almost all of them, I can't think of a single example where they haven't gone to see a counselor. They haven't been through sometimes one or often many crises. And that's a real biblical parallel. If you look at what biblical faithfulness looks like, it's usually the people who almost got snapped in half in life who God uses the most. And I would say that's a profile that continues. So
do you think there's a well-known saying, it's the pruning process none of us want to participate in that produces the results everyone wants to receive? Do you think the pruning process that people go through is the very thing that equips and enables them to have influence?
Yeah, I do. I think that's a really great observation. I wouldn't be able to do what I did if I didn't go through my period of burnout all those years ago. And as difficult as that was, and as deep and dark and despairing as it was, it gave me a lot more empathy than I had, made me take my own success, or whatever you want to call it, a lot less seriously. And it just reforged my character. And you talk to so many of those successful leaders that we all admire, and they've got very similar stories of breaking, stories of, the dark night of the soul. And you look through history, and that seems to be the pattern. And so we want the promise without the pain, but the two are usually connected. And, we all want to live in either Genesis 1 or Revelation 21, but we kind of live in between. And we just have to realize that. And that seems to be what God uses. He uses the breaking, he uses the pain, and he uses the struggle to his glory. Women, by the way, are much better at this than men are. If you follow some of the women thought leaders and the women authors, they are way better at speaking out of their brokenness than men are, because men, really, I do think there's something to men want to be respected. And so we think we have to put our game face on, and everything's great. But women really get that, and they have massive audiences compared to most men.
That's true, actually. Is that because they're willing to be vulnerable then?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you look at Anne Voskamp, you look at her writing. Beautiful. Most men wouldn't share in a book what she shares in a page. And, on her Instagram the other day, she's like, hey, we're all on the struggle bus here in lockdown at my house. And, I've happened to get to know Anne and her family over the last few years. Or Lisa Turkhurst. I mean, when she says, when she's writing a book, that she feels like throwing up and it's the last thing she wants to write because it's too painful and too vulnerable. I think men could learn an awful lot from women writers and women leaders like that, because they are way more vulnerable than I am. And I'm known as a vulnerable writer. And I'm like, I'm not that vulnerable.
Wow, there's something to learn there. Gosh. Well, in a moment, we'd love you to just let us know how we can find out more about what you're doing, how we could subscribe to the podcast. But love to end by asking this question. If a viewer was able to sit down with you for an hour, metaphorically speaking, and have a cup of coffee, and they were coming to you for advice, what would the one piece of wisdom, or what would the theme of that conversation be, and why?
Probably what you hinted at earlier, work twice as hard on your competency or your character as you do on your competency. Let me get that advice right. That really it's character development, because I don't know whether you'll hear this in the recording or not, but, my phone rang through. Very few people ring through on my phone, but it was my oldest son.
Oh.
And one day he'll be standing around my casket. And he won't care about how many million downloads my podcast did or didn't have. He won't care about, how many people read my stuff or how many books I sold or how successful I was. Frankly, he's not going to care about the size of my bank account. What he's going to care about is, did my dad have time for me? Did he love me? Was he there for me? I have two sons. That's what they're going to remember. Tony, my wife, is such an incredible encourager. But at the end of the day, she's going to remember how I treated her, and she's going to remember how I loved her or how I didn't. And I just hung up got off a Zoom call with my longtime assistant, Sarah. And, Sarah's seen me through every season. We've worked together for about 12 years now. And, I want the people closest to me to have the best experience of me. And often in leadership, it's the opposite. Somebody in Seattle thinks you're amazing, who you'll never meet because they follow you on Instagram, but your wife hates you, your kids won't talk to you, and your staff thinks you're a goof. And, so you really look at that. That's the work. That's what the ancients called sanctification. And I think that's the most important thing, Rob, is that's what I've got to work at. And I was talking to John Ortberg last fall. And, I asked him, so what are you going to do in this next season of your life? Not that he was, stepping down anytime soon. He goes, over the next few decades, I really want to focus on who I want to be. I thought, oh, that's a really good answer.
Oh.
Yeah. So, ultimately what you do, if it's sustainable, flows out of who you are. And so if you really want a long track record, and if you really want to do this for decades, you have to fill the being before you fill the doing, because your activity is going to go bankrupt. Your activity, even that whole thing about input versus output, ultimately your input has to at least equal or exceed your output if you're going to have meaningful output. The same's true with your life too. Otherwise, you're a flash in the pan. Otherwise, your character couldn't sustain what your competency built. And so that's what the conversation would probably be about.
Wow. Absolute gold. And what's next for you, Carey? And how can we find what you're up to, the projects you're working on?
Yeah, well, what's next? That's a great question. What's next for the world? Who knows? Yeah. We're committed to helping people thrive in life and leadership. So that's what we do around here. It looks different. I had a year full of speaking just disappear. So we actually pivoted pretty fast like everybody else did. So we're doing online delivery now. And I got a free course I would love for leaders to investigate. So you can go, it's on Leading Through Crisis. It's just that pivot we did really quickly, and it's absolutely free. We've had about 8,000 leaders go through it so far in the last few weeks, and would love to have you check it out. You can go to howtoleadthroughcrisis.com. Just how to lead through crisis.
That will appear on the lower thirds there, guys. You can see.
Oh, that's great. And then if you're listening in America, I know you have a pretty big global audience. I don't think this works internationally, but you can try. Text the word crisis to 33777. We stole all of God's numbers for that. I don't know how my team did it. Like we got 3 and 7.
Good work.
That's like God's numbers. I'm glad it's not like 2666. That would be a disaster.
Yeah,
but 33777, the word crisis will get you the same thing. And that's just our gift to leaders right now, because we're all trying to figure this out. Nobody, and I certainly don't have all the answers, but I think there are some principles that can help you make some really good decisions when everything's uncertain. So we put it all into that course. It's 100% free.
Thank you so much, Carey, and thank you for the wisdom you've shared and poured out today. And we'll be continuing to pray for you and your family that you stay safe and sane in the midst of lockdown.
Hey, Rob, you too. Thank you for what you're doing, the difference you're making in the world, and it's really a thrill to connect with you. Thanks for having me.
All the best now. Thank you.